I love that question, Bob, and it always gives me some pause because I have to also recognize that students are coming with different backpacks, right? Like we always say, fill up your proverbial backpack. What are the tools that you have? People also come from different family situations. People are coming into school and like early workforce with different support systems. And so for our young learners who are struggling financially, food is not always the top of the quote unquote food chain. I respect that. I understand it. I understand that they may be living in what I refer to as the colander, right? They're trying to make ends meet and stop that rain from falling. And so I say that when we talk about nourishment and nutrition, especially with young folks, college, end of college, early workforce, the question is, what can you afford? What's accessible? What's culturally relevant for you? And what's tasty?
Welcome to Momentum Now by MVP, the podcast that delves into the stories of seasoned professionals, charismatic leaders, and passionate catalysts. Join us as we explore their career achievements, the challenges they've overcome, and their advice for young professionals of color navigating a fulfilling career journey. Today, our co-hosts, Karen McFarland and Bob Brooks, sit down with the incredible Maya Feller, the founder and lead dietitian of Maya Feller Nutrition. Maya shares her inspiring journey from experimental theater to becoming a national nutrition expert with features on major platforms such as Good Morning America and the New York Times. Maya also dives into the importance of culturally relevant foods, anti-bias in nutrition, and her mission for food justice, offering practical tips for students and professionals balancing busy careers while maintaining their health and well-being.
Hi, Bob. We're back for another
Karen.
episode of Now, right?
Good to see you. Good to see you. And God, are we excited today? This is going to be a good one.
I know. Thank you. Thank you to our guest. We have today the Maya Feller who is here. And for those who don't know, which I don't know why you wouldn't, I'll just do a brief intro. Maya is the founder and she's a lead dietitian at Maya Feller Nutrition. Her practice provides medical nutrition therapy and nutrition coaching for cardiovascular disease, diabetes, mood disorders, developmental disabilities, and so much more. She's a national nutrition expert, and she shares her nutritional advice with millions through her books, speaking engagements, and appearances on, and I'm going to list them because, Good Morning America, the Today Show. She's got features in the New York Times, Mind, Body, Green. I read that all the time. Well and Good, Food Network, Martha Stewart, Real Simple, Good Housekeeping, Cooking Light, Eating Well, Prevention, Glamour, Self, and more. I just like to list them because, it's just an amazing repertoire of work, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not even done. Hold on, Bob, right? She's also the author of Eating from Our Roots, 80 plus healthy home cooked favorites from cultures around the world. And she co-hosts a podcast called Well Now alongside Dr. Kavita Patel, and it's Slate's new wellness podcast. So Maya, thank you so much for being here. We're so excited to have you.
Thank you, Karen and Bob. Wow, what a welcome. I feel so warm and fuzzy. Like you just gave me like a big virtual hug. Thank you.
And shout out to Sean's grandmother, who's a big fan and just was like, "Oh, I love Maya." I just love that too. Sean,
hey,
you're the best. Yeah, I love it. Well, let's, you know what the show's all about. We're here to give insights and tidbits of advice for our MVP fellows, students who are of color, who are navigating their first couple of years of their career. They're trying to figure it out. How do I get my first job? How do I differentiate myself in the job? What do I do when I'm in an interview? What do I do when I'm being considered for promotion, and everything in between? And I think what's wonderful about your journey is you didn't start out with the thinking like, I'm going to be a nutritionist or I'm going to be a broadcast journalist. You had your undergrad you got your undergrad in theater and philosophy.
That's so
right?
true, Bob. That is very,
love that.
And not just any type of theater, Bob, experimental theater. So really the theater that no one goes to see except for your very strange friends.
I'd love to go to your Christmas party then. That sounds like fun. So how did this all change when you were, I heard, training for the Boston Marathon and you fell in love with nutrition? Tell us that story. Tell us this journey.
Absolutely. So I had finished school, and I actually have this really vivid memory of going to visit a friend who was a director. And he lived in Greenpoint on the 11th floor of a walk up. And it was one of those like 95-degree hot New York City days. And we got to the top floor, burning hot. And we opened the fridge, and the fridge was absolutely empty. And I was like, is this my future as an experimental artist? And I was like, I don't know, truthfully, that I'm up for this type of artist lifestyle. And so I stepped back from the theater and got a conventional job that was really satisfying at the time, Bob and Karen. I love mail. I love to write letters to people. And I was managing massive mail campaigns. And I was like, this is great. And then in my free time, I volunteered, doing like a playground improvement project in really low income areas. And I was like, all right, what am I going to do with myself? I've got all this time. I'm volunteering. And I was like, I'm going to train for the Boston Marathon. So my best friend and I at the time, we signed up and we were running for a charity. I did not qualify because I'm not that fast. And so we said, all right, we would hit the road. We were tearing up the road, getting out there, doing like 10 miles, 15 miles, 18 miles, 22 miles. And every time we had a long run, my running partner would call me 4 hours later. I'm in the hospital again. And I was like, what do you mean? What happened? She was like, I don't know. I overhydrated. I underhydrated. And I was like, okay, whatever we're doing is not working because you continue to end up in the hospital and I'm constantly hungry. So I Googled nutrition for runners. And I was like, oh, this is a thing. I was like, oh, we've been doing it completely wrong. And I remember seeing that I could get a certificate in nutrition. And I called my dad and said, oh, Papi, I think I'm going to get a certificate in nutrition. And he said, a certificate? Now, my dad is a PhD, 2 masters, was the chair of the music department at Wellesley. And he was like, no, he's Haitian. He's like, you should go for the terminal degree. And I was like, oh, like a PhD in nutrition? I was like, I don't think so. I was like, how about a master's? And he's like, that's fine. And so I then went on, because remember, I did my undergrad in theater. And I was like, all right, I have to like study, right? Because I had done philosophy and performative gay theater as my science. I needed the real sciences. So I was like, okay, where can I go and do the prerequisites and still be accepted into a master's program? And it turned out that NYU was the best fit for me. And I ended up going back into clinical nutrition.
Wow.
And yeah, running brought me to it.
Wow.
I'm a fellow NYU grad, so go Violets.
Yay.
That's pretty awesome. So was your dad very happy that you switched to, a master's in nutrition versus experimental theater? I'm just trying to understand his mindset around that shift.
I mean, as a first gen Afro-Caribbean child, there are like a few pathways that we have. It's like medical doctor, PhD, or lawyer. And I had chosen none of those. And so they were like, Buteau, where you stand in a statue position in Tompkins Square Park. They're like, we don't get it. And so I do think in some ways, culturally, it was more acceptable for me to go back to school and have a conventional pathway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I totally get that too. My family's Jamaican. And so those were, lawyer, doctor, and I didn't do any of those either. So they were mortified what my future was going to be.
I mean, I have to say, so my biological mom is like a radical feminist. And I was raised by 2 women. She was totally fine with it. She was like, yeah, experimental theater. So it's interesting, These 2 households had differing ideas. But then in the end, everyone was they're like, all right, great. We love you as you are.
And what
And when you,
what
as
I
you,
wonder about, go ahead, Karen. You keep going. You keep going.
no, 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 go ahead, Bob. Go ahead. I get, go ahead.
What I wonder about is when you were making this pivot, did you feel like you were doing the right thing? Like, or was it a big question mark in your head? Like, I wonder if I'll like this nutritional route, because you've been doing theater and philosophy and this big, I mean, this is a big pivot. So what did that feel like?
It was a huge pivot. I have always enjoyed school. I really do like to study. Even to this day, like I love a conference. You know, there's some people, they're like, oh, I can't stand conferences. It's 7 o'clock in the morning until 10 o'clock at night. I'm like, give it to me. You know, at any given time, I've got a pile of research papers. I tear through books. Like I just love to consume information and acquire more knowledge and then think about how I can synthesize it into something that's actionable. So going back to school, I don't think I knew how much science was involved. And I was like, oh, right, organic chemistry. I see. That is not like, learning about like anything philosophy related. It was intimidating at the time. So, going to NYU, anyway, in nutrition, it's a predominantly cisgender, white, heterosexual, female field. So coming in, I was like a minority. And somehow I lucked out. My cohort was actually really diverse. And there's a class that we take at NYU. It's medical nutrition therapy. And it's this massive class where you basically create a huge binder on every disease state and the nutrition protocol to match it. And my group was a mixed race Haitian woman who now is the founder of a place called Culina Health. She is like a badass rock star, my friend Vanessa Rossetto. A woman from Mexico, Mariana Deneen, who married Brian, who was one of our study partners. A woman from Venezuela named Ina, and then another fellow, Greg Bandalik, myself, and then a woman, Robin Ziemba. Clearly, I remember everybody from my study group.
Shout out.
Right, serious shout out. Not only were we like the best study group, but we all came in from a really different viewpoint and we valued each other. And I think that that's what gave me the strength to make it through the program, being a Afro-Caribbean woman coming from theater. This is a second career. But I had this group and I talked to other dietitians of color and that was not their experience. Like they had cohorts that were predominantly white. There were tons of microaggressions, a lot of really horrible experiences around people questioning their intelligence, like overtly. And so, yeah, Bob, to answer your question, it was a huge pivot. I never questioned if it was the right move because once I got into the hospital, I was at Memorial Sloan Kettering doing my rotations. I was always the first person there and the last to leave. And it didn't matter what was happening, snow, rain, sleet. I was on my way to the hospital because I loved every moment of it.
One of the things I really love about your approach is how you talk about culturally relevant foods and anti-bias in nutrition. Do you think that, and I'd love to dive into that, but do you think that started as part of this cohort because you're part of this really diverse group that potentially introduced these concepts, or is that something that was just part of your psyche way before then?
So I actually think it came from early on. I was raised in this mixed race lesbian home with these very radical moms and a dad who was very radical in and of himself. And all three of my parents are major figures in either feminism or Black academia. And so I come by it honestly. I grew up going to rallies and I had this idea that my voice always mattered. So, I wasn't your average African-American kid born in the 70s. My parents were like, you can, right? I remember Mr. Stead, our principal at the King Open, everybody would stand up and he would say, I want you all to say, I am somebody. And so that was every morning. I am somebody. I got it at school. I got it at home. And we also traveled quite a bit too, Karen, because my mom was doing research throughout Latin America, the Caribbean, and Africa. And she was looking at the Middle Passage and land rights and all sorts of things. And so, I'd be 10 years old. We go to Nigeria, Benin, and they're like, you're going to hang out with this local kid. And I was like, cool. They're like, we're going to, St. Vincent, and you're going to hang out with this local kid. We're going to Australia. You're going to hang out with these indigenous kids. So I really had this upbringing that showed me that people are different and that we can respect the differences, and that it actually can be really powerful because we can learn from each other.
That's incredible, right? To be exposed at such a young age to all of these different cultures. And I can just imagine that, as you walk through life in these different environments, how you have this different respect for it and how you approached it. And I can tell when I listen to you, right? Like the way that you talk about different groups is very different than how most people do it. It's very respectful, right? It speaks to those individuals in a different way, especially when you talk about, things that bring us together around food, which is, can be a huge stigma for certain groups, right, that are othered in this society, right? And so
Absolutely.
that just gives me a lot of insight now as to why you do that.
No, that's right,
So
Karen. So one of the things that I often say when we're looking at food is, in the US, the dominant accepted wellness, kind of what's good, the benchmark, is Anglo-American, Anglo-European. And if that's the center, then everything else is ethnic. And I put that ethnic in quotation marks, but that's what it is. When you go to the grocery store, you have the ethnic food aisle. And because whiteness is centered, specifically that Anglo-American, Anglo-European, as what is socially acceptable to eat, it means that when you eat anything outside of what's accepted, there is a moral hierarchy, and the person eating that other food gets damned. There's a whole set of judgments that society can say, oh, you sat down and you had X food, curry crab and dumpling, fried chicken, collard greens with ham. Well, that's not healthy. You have a diagnosis. You know better than eating that food. Wait a second. But that's not, these are not the conversations that we hear in mainstream. We hear like, oh, you should have your brown rice and your steamed chicken and salmon and broccoli. Fine, but not what everyone is eating.
When I was learning about your background and thinking about nutrition and reflecting when I was in my 20s, I don't think the word nutrition ever spilled out of my mouth. I never thought about nutrition. I just, I grew up in an Italian home, so pasta and red sauce was standard Sunday thing. Pizza was, right. I was a student, so it was Chinese food and pizza and truck food and all that good stuff. So do you think students of today are more aware of the foods they're eating? Do you think it's a different time, or what advice do you have for students? Because, as my mom says, you are what you eat, right? I mean, and she starts the day drinking broccoli juice, by the way. So, she's 96 and doing yoga. Go Grace,
Yes,
mom. Yeah,
yes,
go
mama.
Grace. So like, what are your thoughts about students who are busy, internships, jobs, full time?
So I love that question, Bob. And it always gives me some pause, because I have to also recognize that students are coming with different backpacks, right? Like we always say, fill up your proverbial backpack. What are the tools that you have? People also come from different family situations. People are coming into school and like early workforce with different support systems. And so for our young learners who are struggling financially, food is not always the top of the quote unquote food chain. I respect that. I understand it. I understand that they may be living in what I refer to as the colander, right? They're trying to make ends meet and stop that rain from falling. And so I say that when we talk about nourishment and nutrition, especially with young folks, college, end of college, early workforce, the question is, what can you afford? What's accessible? What's culturally relevant for you? And what's tasty? And is there a way that we can actually bring those things together so that it's supportive of your health, given whatever your family history is? Because, your genes can be a predictor for what's to come, but also given your environment. And so I know that, especially young people who are coming in and they have these high stress jobs where they're working 80, 85, 90 hours a week. And I'm trying to think, okay, well, how do you nourish yourself? And, what's showing up on your plate? This is where I say we want to get creative when you're stepping into a grocery store. We want to learn to shop that entire grocery store. What are the things in the center that you can buy? And if you've got the emotional bandwidth, this is where I say you start to read labels and you say, okay, I want to minimize my added sugars. I want to minimize my added salts, and I want to minimize my synthetic fats. But definitely lean into the center of the grocery store because you don't have time. So people are like, you need to go to the farmer's market. I'm like, actually, you need to get a bag of frozen veggies. So, I think it's a complicated question because I don't have the perfect answer.
Right.
And it's individual dependent.
Right. And it depends. It depends. Yeah. Karen?
Yeah, it brings up so many different questions also around so we talked about students, but just families and their ability, but also the shift in how food is prepared over time. Like, for instance, my mother, she cooks these amazing Caribbean dishes, but they take all day, right? And that's not the kind of time that a lot of people have. And you just referenced students having even less time in those types of preparations. How can families or students with less time, right, still enjoy their own foods in a way that still connects them to their culture, but also meet some of those nutritional needs as well? And how do we identify, maybe the bigger question is, how do we identify if our foods are nutritious? Like, I love oxtail. I have no idea, right, if that is a nutritious meal for me to eat, if I should eat it, once in a while, or if it's good for me to eat 3 times a week. How do we mesh those two things when, as you said, like, everything is from an Anglo-European lens, right? When we have this diversity of flavor profiles and foods within, all of our cultures.
So this is actually where the clinical nutrition part of me turns on. And I actually say to folks, you want to lean into getting to know your primary care provider, because your annuals are the pathway to what's happening with your body internally. You'll notice I didn't actually even talk about food. What I said is, I want you to know what's happening inside. How's your blood pressure? How are your blood sugars? How's your cholesterol? What do your inflammatory markers look like? And this, when you're thinking about work, right, at the end of college, this is when we want to know, will your insurance cover these things? Will your, new job be the place where you can get your teeth cleaned twice a year, that they're going to give you vision, that they're going to have a provider where you don't have to search, like some of my patients, for someone that takes the insurance? Because that's really the deciding factor about what you're going to eat. And then when we talk about bringing cultural foods, things that are culturally relevant into the picture, I think of, Bob, what you said as, Italian family and pasta. I love to use this example because people are always like, oh, you can't eat pasta. And I'm like, but why not? It's like semolita, it's water and salt. Why can't you have it? There's nothing wrong with that, right? And many pastas these days are also now enriched, so there's more vitamins and minerals in them. What's wrong with red sauce? If you don't have like acid reflux, you can totally have red sauce. I don't see the issue with it. But we have been, co-opted to think that there's one pathway forward. And so I say, actually, let your personal health. And for most people, if you can tolerate it, I actually say plants in their abundance should be the center of your plate. Pasta and red sauce, both plants, right? Maybe you want to add some like broccolini or broccoli rabe to it. Or I don't know, maybe you have beans on the side. I have no idea, right? But you go with the things that are familiar and tasty. And if you like oxtail, it becomes the accompaniment, not the main. And the truth is that for many, if we go years and years back, animal proteins were always the accompaniment, not the main. It's just that we're industrialized now and we have different access. Yeah, and so when people were eating hog and fried chicken and all this stuff, they weren't eating it the way that we get it from the corner store, right? It was, as you said, Karen, an all-day event. So you definitely were not having oxtail 3 times a week.
True. That totally makes sense. You said like that.
Yeah.
Totally makes sense.
In the spirit of a pivot, a good pivot, if we could, you've had just an incredible journey. Everything from books and television appearances and publications, everything in between, and what you do for so many patients to help put them on basically treating food as medicine, which is, I just so respect that. When you reflect back and you could give yourself advice when you were 20 something, right? Writing the letter to yourself, right? And put it in the time machine. What advice would you have given the 22-year-old you?
I love that question. And it's really funny. So I actually got married when I was 24. And I have this memory. I was getting dressed with all my girlfriends and the women members of the family in this one room. And I turned to my best friend, who was my running partner at the time, and I said, I want you to take a picture of me. I was in my underwear and bra. I was like, take a picture of me. And she was like, what? I was like, just take a picture of me really quickly. And I said, because I want to remember this moment. She was like, you want to remember this moment with no clothes on? Like, but you have to understand this is the experimental theater, Maya, right? I've always been that person that's like, let's catch this moment. And I said to her, I want to remember being surrounded by all these women in this room getting dressed. I wrapped a little like scarf around my waist. I was a bit more covered up and put my hands up and made this like really funny face. And it is one of my favorite memories and photos of myself because I had somehow like the wherewithal to say, let's capture this moment in time. And I think if I would look back at my 20-something-year-old self and see where I was headed now, I would say, don't forget to do more of that. Don't forget to enjoy the trajectory of where you're going, because there's so many parts of nutrition, Bob, that are so heavy, because it's really, the truth is, like, we're talking about groups that have been historically marginalized. We're talking about systemic inequities. And there's so much that is not about personal choice and more about the zip code that you've been born into, that I forget to say, snap a photo of the levity.
That's great. Yeah.
And that's part of the reason too, I really wanted to like list all your accolades, right? Because sometimes you forget that you've done all these amazing things. It's so easy, especially in what you're doing, right? It's like you said, just pushing a boulder. I think we talked about earlier before the show, pushing a boulder up the hill. That it's you need to take a moment to kind of sit with the good stuff that's happening. As you started your career, though, right, and you made this pivot, how did you? I'm just thinking about college students getting started. How did you get your first opportunity, right? Like, how did that come about? That this is what I'm going to do, and it's going to pivot into this, potentially pivot into this bigger thing.
Yeah.
How did that start off?
Right.
Karen, you're going to laugh so hard.
Okay.
So I'm laughing because I remember the end of school. So all these girls from my program, they're like, I got a job offer at the hospital that I was interning at. And I was like, I need to get a job. I was like, everyone's getting jobs. So I knew I wanted to work in the community because I felt like, okay, so many of us get these top-notch educations and then we don't go and work with disadvantaged groups. And so I was like, I want to work with marginalized people. I was offered a job working at a community-based organization in Brooklyn. And I remember it said HIV, AIDS, Hep C, unstably housed, and substance dependence. I was like, yes,
Wow.
I got this. I got there. And listen, the job I applied for was like dietitian. I get there and they're like, oh, we're so excited. We can't wait to, get this program up and running. I said, what now? I said, what, you can't wait to do what? Get the program up and running. And they're like, yeah, so you're going to help us build this program. And I was like, but I'm the dietitian. I was like, where's my manager? Like, who's in charge of me? I just got out of school.
Yeah.
And I will never forget, they were like, and here's your office. Karen, Bob, it was like the top floor of a building with a desk. I was like, I wish, like the whole mouth drop, everything. It was not what I expected. And so then I worked on building the program and then bringing other dietitians in. And about 3 months in, I was like, we've got to hire a manager. Like someone needs to be like in charge of this. And they're like, we have an idea. How about you? And I was like, again, I was like, I was, well, they were like, you know it best. You've built it and you're really dedicated. I do everything like 110%. I had hooked up with a local CSA to have all the extras delivered every Saturday because we had a meals program. I had organized farm trips. And I was like going in. And I said, all right, fine. And so I took this job and I was probably working like 60 hours a week and I was really, really dedicated. And I didn't think anything of what I was doing. And my mentor at NYU, Lisa Sasson, said to me one summer, it was like the first or second year of my job. She said, will you teach a class at NYU in summer session? Because I'm going to teach in Italy and I would love for you to teach my summer session course. And so I said, absolutely. And that was like the entry into academia. And so the first year I was probably a well-intentioned professor, needed a bit more seasoning. And I had both of those things, right? So I was teaching summer session and then I was working full time. And really in both places, it was about giving back. I thought that it was important for the students to see a Black woman as their professor, someone who was going to challenge them to think critically about where we were in nutrition and where we were headed, how we would treat our patients. And then I really cared deeply about providing my patients who were on all the subsidies with opportunities to dream and be hopeful, to travel to farms and to leave the city and to get organic food, delivered to them and to feed them with dignity and honor and respect them. And so I felt like I was doing a job of purpose, and that was what I cared about. I had no intention of writing books or being in the media, and that happened, I would say almost by accident. And I've never put me, myself, Maya at the forefront. It's always, is what I'm saying going to serve the greater good? And is it something that the most marginalized person can understand and put into action? And so that's where I have always come from. And I think because I had that experimental theater training and I was that funny girl who was like, snap a picture. And my friend was like, really? That when I had the opportunity to go on air, I wasn't actually thinking about me. I was thinking about, am I really portraying the meat and potatoes of this study in a way that people can understand. And in fact, the first time I went on TV, Karen and Bob, I was wearing like my neighbor's dress, and I had just come from the swimming pool and my hair was in an afro. But I had spent like hours reading research studies to prepare myself. And so, the other stuff I did it backwards. Most people right? Because I'm always thinking about people.
Right. And what strikes me is that I'm realizing, and you probably know, that you're a creator, and you're putting your patients or the audience at the center, creating value for them, and that's what's elevated you in your career.
I guess when you say it like that.
Yeah.
I guess,
yeah. So you almost rather, yeah.
I also say it's not an accident, right? Like it may seem, but it's not an accident because you've been very intentional in how you've approached every situation. So even that first job is a prime example, right? Like it wasn't your expectation, but you rose to the occasion. And as Bob said, you created this program and you were in the middle of it. So maybe you didn't think about, again, the success that you had to, but nothing is by accident, because the steps that you took really placed you in each of these steps so that it manifested in the way that it needed to elevate and amplify your core goal. So it's pretty fascinating to see that.
I also have to say, remember, I came from this very supportive background, right? So I grew up with these radical women around a table. And also, even though my dad wasn't in the home, also a very radical father. It is not the usual story that you have this Black man from Haiti who becomes the chair of the music department at a well-esteemed university. So I also came from a place where I was like, well, of course I'm going to work hard, because what I've seen is that it makes an impact. And so I was really following in the trajectory of my family, because I believed that impact was possible. And so when I'm with my patients, even in the community setting, what I was acutely aware of is that what often happens in marginalized communities is that we don't have representation of what that terminal degree is. It's I was the first to, and I was coming from, right?
Yeah.
I know that we can, right? We often say in nutrition, and I mean, now the CDC says it too, right? Racism is that determining factor, not race. And so I know that when I go to take care of a patient, I've got to take all that trauma into consideration before I even make a suggestion. I have to say, you're the expert in your lived experience. Let me learn from you. And how can I best support what you know to be true with evidence?
It's a very unique approach. Like I wish like the medical professionals in my life thought about it in that way, thought about where I come from, my traumas, the good stuff, all of that, and wrap that up into the experience, because it feels very standard when I have those conversations, and it's difficult to talk to them in a way that they understand. So I appreciate you for that. More of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And they have pressures of moving on to the next patient in 2.5 minutes and all those bits and pieces that are now our reality. But I know that time is a factor today for everyone. And gosh, this was fantastic to hang out with you, Maya. I feel like I want to do this again because there's so much more I wanted to ask.
Well, thank you. I do have one thing to say that makes, like, I often think about this with students, because I taught for a decade and I still have interns. And usually when an intern comes on, the first thing that I say is, I want to spend an hour with you and I want to hear from you, like what it is that you need. And I always tell my interns and students, like, if you're in a place where people won't listen, then that's not the place for you. I understand if you need to make money, but there should be someone at the leadership level that is willing to hear you so that they can mentor you and help you move forward.
It's true. I'd much rather have a position with a great team in a position I might not be super excited about, but the team I'm excited about, than have a great position with a team that I'm not excited about.
Agreed.
Team and the people that you work with and the mentors you have made a real big difference in my life, and I'm sure in lots of others too. Karen, could you do a wrap up for us? And then I'll move to some rapid fire questions.
I was so engrossed in this conversation, so we're gonna have to do my wrap up kind of by ear. But
you can tag team with me. I can tag team with you.
Tag team, yeah.
I got you covered. All right,
Mine
all right.
So many nuggets.
Fun. The one big nugget for me from today, Maya, is just embrace the now. Whether it's that moment when you stared at an empty refrigerator or that moment when you said, snap a picture, is embracing the now and taking a lesson from that now and making it part of who you are. I think that's a really important. Embracing the pivot, like you've made multiple pivots, and look to create value for whoever your customer is, whether it's a patient, an audience in front of you, a community of people that are navigating HIV, and whatever it might be. If you're creating value for your audience and your customers, there will be a natural levitation of good stuff for you, whether that's career or opportunities or whatever it might be. What else, Karen? You got any others for me here?
Yeah, I'm a huge takeaway for me, and I think for all of us, which is really helpful, is really just being open to different perspectives and different cultures and how they interact with the world, and even specifically, like you talked about, health and nutrition, right? That is something that I think is super unique, and we don't think about that, and also will allow us all to embrace ourselves in a very different way than what is quote unquote normal in society. But also leveraging your support system. You've talked a lot about your incredible support system at home, and I know people have varying levels of that, but it really seems to have set the tone for how you wanted to progress in life and allowed you to be able to pivot in those ways. And they, of course, I think it's safe to say, were your first mentors, right? That's so critical in life to have that gift growing up. And also, I think you just said this, it was believe impact is possible. I think that's super powerful, right? That belongs on a t-shirt, on billboards, everything, right? Because you have to have that confidence and that belief system in yourself and in your work in order for it to progress and be amplified in many different ways.
Ooh, impact is possible. Impact is possible.
Believe impact is possible. The believe part is important.
Believe impact. All right. So some rapid fire questions before we let you go. Ready?
Ready.
All right. What was your favorite subject in high school?
Oh, okay. My favorite subject in high school was philosophy.
What was your least favorite subject in high school?
So it's funny because I feel like I should say science or math, but I actually loved my science teacher, Miss Cecile Little, so much, but I don't recall the math teacher at all.
What's the best advice you've ever been given?
The best advice I've ever been given is from my mom, which is, what can you take off your plate? Mm-hmm. Right? When you're overwhelmed and you're like, I've got so much going on, and it's a real sit down and think about what are the things that you can remove from your to-do list that don't negatively impact whatever it is that you're working on.
Have you received some advice that was just bad advice that was the worst advice you received?
Yes, I have, and I don't know that I can actually say it publicly because I went against it.
All right, well then, good. Next question. What's your greatest superpower?
Oh my gosh, my greatest superpower, I think, is probably that I'm really sensitive, and a lot of people don't know that.
Huh.
I'm super sensitive.
Wow. How do you navigate that?
Well, it's helpful that I'm very direct and I'm straightforward.
Yeah.
So like it's like I'm pretty honest. It's very like I'm not pretty honest. I'm really honest. I say the truth. And I do a lot of like reset on my own. Like I got to go for a run, or I got to take a very hot bath. So I have some good self-care coping mechanisms, and I'm a huge proponent of therapy, because I think that you need spaces where you can figure out what's intrusive thoughts versus what is reality. And especially if you're a sensitive person, you have to know what stories are yours and what stories are not.
Last question from me. What's your why? Why do you do what you do?
I do what I do because I really believe that in the future, there will be food justice and equity for people who have previously not mattered. I feel like I'm always so serious.
Well, I remember that when you said, like, take a picture.
I know, right?
Not always serious. That was at one time. That was at one time where they got the picture. They can prove it.
Right.
Maya, thank you so much for being part of creating momentum in all kinds of communities, being part of our show, Momentum Now, and helping us provide access and opportunity to the community that we support and giving them insights. Thank you for doing so much for so many.
Thank you,
Thank
Bob,
you. It was such
thank
a
you,
pleasure.
Karen.
Yeah.
Listen, I'm a child of the 70s too, so we have to talk later to see if we went to NYU at the same time. So we'll see.
We probably did.
Until then. Thank you so much.
Thank you both.